Well, hello, friends. I hope you're doing well today. I'm currently in Minnesota. I'm getting ready to participate in the EFCA1 virtual conference, and it's good to be here connecting with some friends who are physically present for this conference. I've been reminded of just the goodness of Christian community. I think this past year, many of us were reminded how good it is to be together in person, in community. And that's what I want to talk about today in this devotional. Living as a community of exiles, not just individuals, but a community of exiles. So I'm going to read 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. I want to consider three different ingredients that I think are necessary for living as a community of exiles. The first ingredient that we observe in this passage is that we need community if we are going to flourish in exile. We sometimes take it for granted that these passages that we read are addressed not just to individuals, but to communities. And so Peter is writing not just to individuals scattered around the Roman Empire, but he is writing to scattered churches, groups, probably meeting in homes, small communities of disciples. And we need to be aware of the context of this letter. We don't come to chapter 5 in 1 Peter and think that Peter just sat down and thought, should I write about church leadership now? No, he's writing about church leadership because he wants to help those in exile live well in their communities. And so I think we need to remind ourselves again and again, especially in our Western world that seems to prize individuality and autonomy, that it is necessary to be part of community if we are going to flourish in exile. I'm simply convinced of this. We cannot truly follow Jesus and not be part of his community. That's the assumption of 1 Peter, is these people are part of Christ's community. So first thing, we need a community if we're going to flourish well in exile. Second principle in this text, and that is Christian community needs leadership and structure if it's going to flourish. Peter is writing, giving instructions for leadership in the church. And again, this is not just him sitting down, making a textbook. This is him giving very timely instructions for these exile communities to be able to endure persecution, to be able to continue to grow in faith, and to live well together as elect exiles in the Roman Empire, and they need godly leadership and structure to be able to flourish. And it's important to note that he's not simply telling them just to adopt, pick a leader, make sure you have a leader who's in charge. He's giving them a kingdom principles for their leadership and structure. See, we are to live as exiles or ambassadors in this world. That means that though we live in this world, we are living according to the values of another kingdom. It's the values of the other kingdom, God's kingdom, that we are to derive our leadership principles from. I mean, Jesus said it this way in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 and 43. He said, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant." See, we tend to absorb and conform to worldly patterns of leadership more than we realize. We just seem to take on the governing structures around us. Again, more than we realize. And Jesus is reminding us, and now Peter is reminding us in this text, that that's not to be the case. We are to derive our leadership principles from God's kingdom. And I think there's two correctives that are going on in this 1 Peter 5 passage. One, that Peter is giving a corrective to an authoritarian style of leadership. He is encouraging the churches. He's talking to elders, to leaders in the church. He wants them to lead, but he says not to be domineering. That is, it's not simply leading based on your will, your preference, for your glory, being harsh, making sure everyone is falling in line with your will. He's talking about being an example to the flock, that leading out of your life, out of your example, out of your relational connectedness. And Peter uses himself as an example. I think it's pretty striking that when Peter first addresses the elders, he addresses them as, he says, as a fellow elder. Now, Peter had all the credentials in the world in that time to be able to appeal to them from a level of positional authority. Peter's top dog. And he could have simply said, listen, I know what I'm talking about. I walked with Jesus. I've been doing this a while. Here's the instructions. And he doesn't. He says, I appeal to you as a fellow elder. That's a really humble posture for him to take. And he's modeling them, the kind of leadership that elders are to take, coming alongside and modeling what it looks like to follow Jesus Christ. And so he's giving an authoritarian corrective, because certainly leadership in the Roman world, in the Roman Empire, was very authoritarian. Those who were in charge, led by their positional authority and led by force. And Peter's giving a different vision of leadership. But it's not only an authoritarian corrective that Peter gives, he actually also gives an anti-authoritarian corrective. In verse 5, Peter encourages those who are younger to be subject to the elders. And that phrase kind of grates on our modern ears, be subject to the elders. I think we need this corrective today. We tend towards an anti-authoritarian view of leadership in our culture, a more flat view. And it's going to be tough to live in Christian community with either an authoritarian view of leadership or an anti-authoritarian view of leadership. I was scrolling through my Facebook feed a few months back, and the powers that be behind Facebook had their algorithms all figured out, and for some reason ads started popping up in my feed for this clothing line made by a group called Lions Not Sheep. And as I looked at this apparel line, all their shirts and things had different phrases that were all tailored to appeal to those who were very anti-authoritarian in their view of leadership. This is what it said on their site. It said, you have two choices, to lead or to be led. We are a generation of leaders. We are a generation of lions. And it's a real appeal to don't be a sheep, don't just be led along, make sure you're the one doing the leading. The problem is, if everyone's doing the leading, who's following? And how are we going to get along when we disagree on which direction we should go? The truth is, in Christian community, that can't be our mindset if we are going to flourish. And so Peter's given a corrective that we're not to have an authoritarian style of leadership, nor an anti-authoritarian style of leadership. Instead, the third principle here is that everyone in God's community needs humility. Everyone in God's community needs humility. Verses 5 and 6, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility. Leaders and followers alike, elders, those who are not elders, that we all need to clothe ourselves with humility. Now, humility does not mean that there are not leaders in Christ's community. There are. Leaders need humility. Followers need humility. Now, this past year has been a very hard and I think a very revealing year for the church. We've seen it be very difficult for people to get along. There have been very different opinions on the direction church should take. When we had government restrictions placed upon the church, people had different ideas on how we should respond to those restrictions, different ideas on whether we should, on the precautions we should take in our worship gatherings. And a lot of those differences of opinion became very pronounced to the point of conflict. And I think it revealed a couple things about Christ Church in this season, things that are difficult. Well, let me share those two with you. The first I think it revealed is that secondary issues at times became primary this past year. Our views on how we should handle things with government restrictions, or our political views, became focal points, primary things, instead of secondary things. And that was challenging. But also what was revealed in this past season is that humility was lacking. Humility was lacking. There's been an unwillingness to listen to people who have a different opinion, an unwillingness to bear with others with whom we disagree, but it's the quickness to divide. And Christian community cannot flourish without humility. And so Peter writes to the church in the Roman Empire, and he's encouraging all of followers of Jesus Christ in the various churches across the Roman Empire to clothe themselves with humility. And we need to hear these instructions today as well, to clothe ourselves with humility. It is more important that we live righteously, rightly in relationship with one another, than we be right about all the secondary issues that we become so passionate about. So for those who are living in exile community, it's really important that we pay attention to these three principles, that we need a community in which to flourish. We need leadership and structure that's not authoritarian or anti-authoritarian. And above all, we need humility. I pray that God would give us the ability to live these principles well in our day. God's best to you. Have a great week.